The first time Emmett Callahan heard those words, he was standing on his sagging porch, holding a plate of burnt beans and stale bread, trying to decide if it was worth eating. The woman at his gate was thin, dusty from the road, and trembling despite the summer heat. Her black dress hung loose on her frame, and her hands gripped the fence post like it was the only thing holding her upright. "If I can feed you," she said, her voice steady but quiet, "let me stay." He didn't answer right away, just looked at her, then at the plate in his own hand, then back at her face. It wasn't a young face, but it wasn't old either. Somewhere in that hard place between hope and surrender, her eyes didn't beg, they simply waited. Emmett Callahan was 62 years old, and he'd been alone for most of them. He'd never married, never found the time or the courage or the right woman. His ranch had dwindled down to a few head of cattle, a vegetable patch he couldn't keep up with, and a house that felt bigger and colder every year. The town of Bitter Creek knew him as a decent man, a hard worker once, but now just another aging bachelor slowly fading into the prairie dust. And here stood a woman, a widow by the look of her mourning dress, offering him a trade so simple it felt like mercy. He should have said no, he knew what the town would say. But his stomach was empty, his hands were tired, and the beans on his plate had been burning every night for 2 years. So he stepped aside and let her in. That was the beginning. And months later, when the whole town finally understood what had really happened, there wasn't a single person in Bitter Creek who could find words. Her name was Clara Brennan, and she told him almost nothing that first night. She walked into his kitchen, looked around at the cast iron skillet caked with grease, the dusty shelves, the sack of cornmeal spilling onto the counter, and she didn't say a word. She just rolled up her sleeves, pumped water into the basin, and started washing. Emmett stood in the doorway, awkward as a schoolboy, watching her move through his space like she'd been there all along. "There's a room upstairs," he said finally. "It's small, but it's got a bed. That'll do. I can't pay you much." She turned, her hands still wet. "I didn't ask for pay, I asked to stay," he nodded slowly. "All right then." She made him scrambled eggs that night with wild onions she'd found near the road and a bit of salt pork from his stores. It was the best meal he'd had in years. He ate in silence, and when he was done, she took his plate without a word and washed it clean. By the time the sun came up the next morning, Clara had scrubbed his kitchen, organized his pantry, and baked 2 loaves of bread that filled the house with a smell Emmett had forgotten existed. He didn't ask her why she'd come, and she didn't offer to tell him, but the town Bitter Creek had eyes everywhere, noticed within the week. "You hear Emmett Callahan's got himself a woman, a widow, they say," moved right in with him. No preacher, no announcement, just showed up and stayed. Shameful. At his age, too. The talk started quiet, the way it always did, but it didn't take long before it reached the church steps, the general store, and the Sunday social. Emmett heard it in the way people looked at him when he came into town for supplies. Clara heard it in the silence that followed her when she walked past the post office. But neither of them said a word in their own defense. Emmett had lived most of his life without softness. His parents had died when he was young, and he'd been raised by an uncle who believed work was the only kind of love a man needed. He'd spent his 20s building the ranch, his 30s keeping it going, and his 40s watching it start to slip through his fingers. By the time he hit 50, he'd accepted the truth: he would die alone and the land would go back to dust. He'd made peace with it, or thought he had. But then Clara Brennan walked into his life and started feeding him. It wasn't just the food, though the food was a miracle in itself. It was the way she set the table each night, even though it was just the 2 of them. The way she mended the curtains he hadn't noticed were torn. The way she hummed while she worked, low and steady like the sound of the wind through the grass. She didn't talk much, and neither did he, but there was a comfort in the quiet. One evening, about 2 weeks after she'd arrived, Emmett came in from mending the fence and found her standing in the garden, hands on her hips, staring at the overgrown rows of beans and squash. "This could be something," she said. "Used to be," he replied. "I just couldn't keep up with it." She glanced at him, and for the first time he saw something like sadness in her eyes. "I know the feeling." That night after supper he finally asked, "Why'd you come here, Clara?" She was washing dishes, her back to him. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then quietly she said, "Because I had nowhere else to go. No family, no one who'd want me." He didn't push. He understood that kind of loneliness. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "you're welcome here, long as you want." She turned, and the look she gave him was so full of gratitude it made his chest ache. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded and left the room before the feeling got too big to hold. By the end of the first month, the gossip had grown teeth. "It's indecent, is what it is. Living under the same roof and neither of them young enough to pretend innocence. She's taking advantage of him, mark my words. Probably after his land." "What land?" "Emmett's got nothing left but that old house and a few head of cattle." "Then what's she after?" No one had an answer, and that made the talk even worse. It was Vera Holloway, the preacher's wife, who finally took it upon herself to intervene. She arrived at Emmett's door on a Wednesday afternoon unannounced, carrying a basket of muffins and a well-practiced expression of concern. Clara answered the door. "Good afternoon," Vera said, her smile thin. "I've come to speak with Mr. Callahan." "He's out checking the cattle," Clara replied. "Can I help you?" "Perhaps you can." Vera's eyes swept over Clara, taking in the flour on her apron, the tidiness of the porch. "I'll be blunt, Mrs. Brennan. The town is concerned." "About what?" "About this arrangement." Clara's expression didn't change. "What arrangement would that be, you living here alone with a man you're not married to?" Vera leaned in slightly. "Surely you understand how it looks." "It looks," Clara said evenly, "like a woman cooking for a man in exchange for a roof." "That's all it is it?" Vera's voice sharpened. "Because it looks to some like you're taking advantage of a lonely old man." Clara's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "Mr. Callahan is free to ask me to leave any time he wishes." "He hasn't?" "Well, perhaps someone ought to ask him if he truly wants you here or if he's simply too kind to say otherwise." Before Clara could respond, Emmett's voice came from behind Vera. "I want her here." Both women turned. Emmett stood at the edge of the porch, dusty and tired, his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I appreciate your concern. But Clara's done more for me in a month than anyone in this town has done in 10 years. She stays as long as she wants, and that's the end of it." Vera's face flushed. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked back to her buggy without another word. When she was gone, Clara looked at Emmett. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he said quietly. "I did." Summer turned to autumn, and the garden Clara had revived produced more vegetables than Emmett had seen in a decade. She canned tomatoes, pickled cucumbers, made preserves from wild plums, and stored potatoes in the cellar. The pantry, once nearly bare, was now lined with jars that glowed like jewels in the lamplight. Emmett watched her work with something close to awe. She moved through the world with a quiet, relentless competence, as if survival itself was a skill she'd been forced to master. But he also saw the moments when she thought he wasn't looking, the way her hands would still on the counter, the way she'd stare out the window at nothing, her face distant and haunted. One night in late October, after the first frost, Emmett found her sitting on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the stars. He sat down beside her, slow and careful, his joints protesting. "Cold tonight?" he said. "Yes." They sat in silence for a while, then Emmett said, "You ever think about telling me what you're running from?" She didn't look at him. "Every day, but you won't." "I don't want to bring it to your door," he nodded. "Fair enough." Another long silence. Then Clara said, soft as the wind, "I had a husband once. He wasn't a good man, and when he died, the people he owed money to came looking for me." Emmett's chest tightened. "They hurt you?" "They tried." She pulled the shawl tighter. "I ran. Changed my name, kept moving until I didn't have anything left." She finally looked at him. "And then I found you." "You didn't find me," Emmett said. "You saved me." Her eyes widened slightly. "I didn't." "Yes, you did." He held her gaze. "I was dying," Clara slowly, "didn't even realize it, but I was. And you walked up to my gate and gave me a reason to live again. She looked away, her throat working. I just cook your meals. You do more than that. His voice was rough. You make this place feel like a home. For a moment, he thought she might cry, but instead she reached out and placed her hand over his. It was the first time they'd touched. And Emmett felt something he hadn't felt in 62 years, hope. Winter came hard that year. Snow piled up against the fences and the wind howled through the cracks in the barn. Emmett and Clara worked side by side to keep the cattle fed, the firewood stocked, and the house warm. The town's gossip had quieted, mostly because no one wanted to brave the cold to spread it. But Emmett knew it hadn't gone away, it was just waiting. In December, a stranger came to town. He was a tall man, well-dressed, with cold eyes and a smooth voice. He asked questions at the general store, the saloon, the boarding house. Questions about a woman, a widow, dark hair, thin, probably using a different name. The storekeeper, a man named Carl, didn't like the look of him, so he lied. No one like that here, Carl said. The stranger didn't believe him, but he left. Carl rode out to Emmett's place that same afternoon. When Emmett opened the door, Carl said, "There's a man in town looking for a woman, thought you should know." Emmett's blood went cold. What kind of man? The kind that doesn't take no for an answer. Emmett found Clara in the kitchen. When he told her, her face went white. "I have to leave," she said immediately. "I won't bring this on you." "No, Emmett, you don't understand." "I understand just fine." He stepped closer. "You're not running anymore, Clara, not unless you want to. But if you stay, I'll stand with you. He's dangerous. So am I when I need to be." She stared at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why would you do this?" "Because you're not just someone who cooks my meals." His voice was steady. "You're the woman I love." The words hung in the air like the first snow of winter, soft, undeniable, transforming everything. Clara's breath caught. "Emmett, you don't have to say it back," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know, whatever happens, you're not alone." She stepped forward and took his hands. "I love you too," she whispered. "I have for months, I just didn't think I had the right." "You have every right." That night they sat together by the fire, making a plan. And the next morning, Emmett rode into town and went straight to the sheriff. The sheriff's name was Tom Grady, and he was a fair man. He listened to Emmett's story without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This stranger," Tom said. "He's looking for her because of debts?" "Her dead husband's debts," Emmett clarified. "She doesn't owe them anything, but they don't see it that way." Tom nodded slowly. "And you're sure you want to stand in the middle of this?" "I'm marrying her," Emmett said, "soon as we can arrange it." Tom raised his eyebrows. "That'll give the town something to talk about." "Let them talk," the sheriff smiled. "All right then, bring her in tomorrow, we'll get the preacher, make it official. Once she's your wife legally, those debts aren't hers, and if this man comes back, I'll have a word with him." Emmett nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Tom. Don't thank me yet, just take care of her, she's been through enough." The wedding was small, just Emmett, Clara, the preacher, the sheriff, and Carl from the general store as a witness. Clara wore a simple blue dress she'd made from fabric Emmett had bought her. Emmett wore his only suit, brushed clean and smelling of cedar. When the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Emmett leaned down and pressed his lips to Clara's forehead, gentle as a prayer. And Clara, for the first time since he'd met her, smiled like she believed in tomorrow. But the stranger came back 3 days later. He arrived at the ranch just after noon, riding a black horse, his coat dusted with snow. Emmett met him at the gate, rifle in hand. "Can I help you?" Emmett's voice was calm. "I'm looking for a woman," the stranger said. "Name of Clara, she owes a debt." "No one here by that name," the stranger's eyes narrowed. "I heard different." "Then you heard wrong." Emmett didn't move. "This is my land and you're not welcome on it." The man's hand moved toward his coat and Emmett raised the rifle. "Don't," Emmett said. For a long moment they stared at each other. Then the sound of hoofbeats came up the road and Sheriff Grady appeared, flanked by 2 deputies. "Afternoon," Tom called. "Something I can help you with?" The stranger looked from Emmett to the sheriff, then back again. He smiled, cold and sharp. Just passing through, then keep passing, Tom said. The stranger tipped his hat and rode off. Tom waited until he was out of sight, then turned to Emmett. He'll be back, I know, but not today, Tom smiled. And maybe not ever if word gets around that Clara Callahan is under my protection. Emmett let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Thank your wife, Tom said. She's the one who had the courage to stay. Spring came slowly that year, but when it arrived, it brought wildflowers and new calves and the smell of fresh earth. Clara planted the garden again, bigger this time, with rows of beans and squash and carrots. Emmett worked beside her, his back straighter than it had been in years, his hands steady. The town had finally stopped talking, or rather, they'd started talking differently. You see, Emmett's place looks better than it has in 20 years. That wife of his is a miracle worker. She brought him back to life, if you ask me, and he gave her a home. Fair trade, I'd say. One Sunday after church, Vera Holloway approached Clara. Her face was pinched, but her voice was sincere. Mrs. Callahan, she said. I owe you an apology. Clara looked at her, surprised. You don't? I do. Vera took a breath. I judged you without knowing you. That was wrong. I'm sorry. Clara nodded slowly. Thank you. Vera hesitated, then added, if you ever need anything, you're welcome to call on me. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a start. That evening, Emmett and Clara sat on the porch watching the sun set over the hills. The sky was painted gold and pink, and the air smelled like grass and rain. Do you ever regret it? Emmett asked. Staying here? Clara looked at him, her eyes soft. Not for a single moment. Even with all the trouble, especially with the trouble, she leaned her head on his shoulder. You gave me more than a place to stay, Emmett. You gave me a life. He wrapped his arm around her. You gave me one too. They sat in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. And for the first time in both their lives, they felt whole. Months had passed since Clara had stood at Emmett's gate and spoken those words, if I can feed you, let me stay. And now the entire town understood what Emmett had known from the beginning. She hadn't been asking for charity. She'd been offering a partnership, a trade between two lonely people who'd found in each other exactly what they needed. She had fed him. And in return, he had given her a home, a name, and a love that would last the rest of their days. It was a simple arrangement, but it had saved them both. Some stories aren't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. They're about the quiet moments, a meal shared, a hand held, a door left open when it could have been closed. Emmett and Clara's story was one of those. A widow and a bachelor, both worn down by life, finding each other at the exact moment they needed saving. She asked for shelter and offered her skill. He gave her a home and found his heart again. The town of Bitter Creek had judged them, as towns do. But in the end, they saw the truth, that sometimes love looks like practicality and sometimes mercy looks like a trade. And that the bravest thing a person can do is ask for help, and the kindest thing another can do is say yes. If you've ever felt alone or worn down or like you had nothing left to offer, remember this: you are never too old, too tired, or too broken to start again. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to see you, one hand reaching back, one door left open. Thank you for riding along with us today here at Rusted Saddle Stories. If this story touched your heart, we'd be grateful if you'd like it, share it, and subscribe for more tales from the old frontier. And remember, no matter where you are on your own trail, you're never too far gone for a second chance. Until next time, keep writing.